In 1996, its objective is to establish a united, independent Irish Republic with its own independent foreign policy, pursued primarily through reform United Nations, with positive neutrality as its key component. There aren't that many individual members, but there's a reasonable number of organisations affiliated. They include AFRI, the Centre for Global Education, the Putin Support Group, COLA, the Communist Party of Ireland, Cork Council of Trade Unions, Dublin Council of Trade Unions, ERGI, the Green Party, the Irish Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, Irish CND, Irish National Congress, Irish Missionary Union, Pax Christi, Sinn Féin, Unite the Union and the Workers' Party. So it's quite a broad alliance. As far as PAN is concerned, we are a profoundly European organisation, but our concept of the future of Europe is a partnership Europe, a social Europe, a Europe of independent democratic states, legal equals without a military dimension. In short, an anti-imperialist Europe. And we didn't get those values from nowhere. I mean, way back in 1790, Wolfe Tone wrote a pamphlet where he argued, when it looked like there might be a war between the Spanish Empire and the British Empire, that Ireland should stay neutral. He went on, obviously, as people know, to advocate unity between Catholic Protestant and the centre, and to advocate an Irish Republic. So if you like, the concepts of Irish neutrality, the concept of Irish independence and democracy are intertwined and go back well over 200 years. In the treaty negotiations that established this state, those representing the Irish Republic advocated and sought permanent neutrality as part of the agreement between the emerging state and the British Empire. It did get the right to stay neutral and didn't take part in the Second World War, and neither did it join NATO. But of course the imperial tradition is also exceptionally strong. All during the 19th century, early 20th century, 30% of the Irish army, of the British army, were Irish. Major political leaders supported the various wars of the empire. Daniel O'Connell, for example, supported the British Empire's war on China to make certain they brought British heroin. Isaac Button supported the Crimean War, and of course Carson and Redmond encouraged 180,000 people to volunteer to die fight and die in the 1914-18 Imperial War. So if you like, both of those two traditions are very strong in Ireland. Northern Ireland, as we know, is still part of the British Union. And while it is true that the empire is somewhat a pale shadow of its former self, its commitment to imperialism retains itself as one of its core values. For example, it spends $2 billion a year on maintaining its nuclear weapons. It spent $2 billion a year on its Afghan war, and its war in Libya so far has costed $2 billion. So these are very large and substantial military financial commitments to their wars. But it wasn't until you had the formation of the European Union and or as the first called the European Economic Community and later the European Union, that you had a situation where the Irish political elite wanted to see if they could restore imperialism as the value again throughout the whole of Ireland. And what happened, of course, is in treaty after treaty after treaty, they advocated transferring power away from the Irish people to the European Union, from the Irish people's own democratic institutions to the EU and its institutions. And I think the core reason for that was that they wanted Ireland to take the full and active part in the imperial war, in the imperial resource wars of the 21st century. I think that's why they were advocating it. We argued in 1996 that the only and absolute inevitable consequences of that particular strategy would be the defeat of the EU US-NATO axis and the collapse of the economic policy, the economic concepts that underline that in those imperial values. I think it might be reasonable to say that far more people would argue that that's not an unreasonable position to adopt now than did in 1996. See, the EU is essentially dominated by imperial powers, deeply rooted imperial traditions. Countries like Britain and Belgium, France, Germany, Holland, Italy, Spain, Portugal. They lost their empires in the anti-imperial wars of the last century. And I think what they essentially seek to do is by combining by bringing themselves together to re-establish that military domination. I mean, Chancellor Merkel, arguably one of the most powerful people in the European Union, consistently has regularly called for the creation of a European army. And there's nothing new about that. You know, political leader after EU political leader has called for the creation of a European army and more militarisation. And I think essentially they seek to do it in conjunction with the United States of America. And the chosen instrument of that cooperation is NATO. NATO decided to bomb Libya and install their own puppet regime in power. The French newspaper Libération published a letter where the Libyan TNC ratified the agreement, which ceded 35% of Libya's crude oil production to France. If there ever was a resource war, then the war in Libya is a textbook case. And I think the new EU embassy that they established in Tripoli in the middle of this war is a kind of an outward manifestation of this is the first major imperial war led essentially by the European part of the EU-US-NATO axis. I think it's not unreasonable to think that the next target won't be Syria or Iran, it could be Niger, because it has substantial uranium resources. Now, the direct cost to Ireland has been relatively small. I mean, after all, there's only about 8 to 10 Irish soldiers in Afghanistan. During the Celtic Tiger era, the state was spending €1 billion. But since we only have, unlike Greece, a very, very small army of about 10,000, all during the Celtic Tiger era, we were actually spending more money per soldier than any other country in Europe. And much of that was based on buying new military equipment so that it could be interoperable with NATO, with the NATO forces. Now, there's nothing new about this. I mean, the process of the militarization of Europe didn't spring out of nowhere. If you can go back to the Single European Act, and the Maastricht Treaty, and then the Amsterdam Treaty. Now, we were founded only, fairly soon before the Amsterdam Treaty, so it was our first major campaign. And what we saw then was when the Danes had voted against the Maastricht Treaty, they had gained a protocol that would exclude them from becoming involved in the process of militarization. I quote, "With regard to the measures adopted by the Council in the relevant articles, Denmark does not participate in the elaboration and implementation of decisions and actions which have defence implications, but will not prevent the development of closer cooperation between member states in this area. Therefore, Denmark shall not participate in their adoption. Denmark shall not contribute to the financing of the operation expenditures arising from such measures." So essentially in our campaigns, in the Amsterdam Treaty, the Nice referendum, and the Lisbon referendum, essentially all we saw was the same kind of protocol. It's a fairly modest demand. We weren't calling the end of the world. Here was a country that was already in the European Union, got this protocol, so why couldn't we have it? And in fact, we've been lobbying members of the Dáil to advocate that when the Croatian accession treaty, which will be signed in the next period of time, that this protocol be added to the Croatian accession treaty. And Sinn Féin have said they will more than likely support that concept. Now, an indication, of course, what we're up against is clearly what happened at the last Lisbon referendum. People voted no, and the second time round, the yes people spent millions. And I mean millions. I think it was Intel alone spent $1 million, and Ryanair spent $1 million. So there was a really, really big money. And I think it was the core reason why they won. They just spent so much money. And I think that the corporate media largely excludes PAN and many organisations from allowing us to put our case. Not completely, but it's pretty universal. In fact, trying to get any media coverage for this conflict itself is not easy. In fact, none, I think. We actually got no media coverage from any corporate media for the conflict. Now, of course, when they won, this was essentially a class victory. I mean, the rich won. Because that's what it was. It was a battle by the rich against the ordinary people. I'm going to give you an example of what that means, in fact. There was a survey 1 week there, it was about a couple of months ago, where 20%, it showed that 20% of the Irish people in the country, after a month, have a disposable income of €70. In the same week, the CEO of AIB retired and he walked away with €3 million in his back pocket. In 2007, the Bank of Ireland Asset Management reported, and it's not a revolutionary socialist organisation, and it said basically that 40% of the wealth of the entire country is owned by 5% of the population. And yet what's happening? The current Fianna doesn't make much difference, Fine Gael Labour government is advocating in fact that we sell off €2 billion worth of state assets, and that will be bought cheap, I presume, by their friends in the corporate sector. Instead, of course, taxing the wealth of the 5% that own 40% of the wealth, that would raise the €2 billion. No question of that happening with the current crowd. And of course, that kind of distortion of wealth is reflected globally. The number of billionaires between 2007 and 2010 rose by 1/3. So all just economic crisis, there was this huge increase in the number of billionaires. In fact, for example, 1,000 individuals have a combined wealth of 4,500 billion. So you have this enormous concentration of wealth in the hands of a very small number of people. Now, what were the direct consequences of the passing of the last EU treaty? Well, obviously, the key one is that the EU now has its own distinct legal identity, superior to each of the individual member states. It's appointed an EU president and an EU de facto minister for foreign affairs who has an EU department who presides over a growing Department of Foreign Affairs, the EU department. They've established the right of a group of member states under what's called structured cooperation to form separate military blocs within the EU, and I quote, for quote, more demanding military measures, and quote, in accordance with the principle of a single set of forces. Now, a body that has so described is an army. It legalises the European Defence Agency, the purpose of which is to promote and develop European arms industry. It has legalised the EU battle groups, which are heavily armed, 2,500 strong rapid reaction military units, specifically designed to go to war after 4 or 5 days' notice from the European Union. Up to now, Ireland has participated in the Nordic battle group, along with Estonia, Finland, Norway and Sweden. And of course, Norway is not a member of the European Union, it's a member of NATO. In fact, I think Turkey is a member of NATO as well, and it's also taking part in the EU battle groups. Now, in 2011, it was made ready for action, and the EU committee agreed that if requested by the UN, it could invade Libya for, quote, humanitarian reasons. The cost of the Irish Army participation in the EU battle groups was about €1 million. Now, in 2012, next year, the Irish government has already agreed that the Irish Army, so Irish soldiers, will now take part in the German-Austrian EU battle group. Probably for the same cost and probably with the same remit to invade Libya if so requested. Now, of course, it will be said, and it is legitimate, there is what's called a triple lock, i.e. the government, the Dáil and the UN approval before Irish troops can take part in EU battle groups and be sent to war. But I don't think there will be any doubt that the existing government would agree to send them into battle. And of course, there was a big change to the legislation, because it was amended to allow Irish soldiers to go in as part of a battle group into a battle without a UN mandate, but not actually fight until they get the UN mandate. But of course, once the battle group is there, I mean, they're probably going to be attacked, and not unreasonably, they'll defend themselves. I think the phrase, it's called an Irish solution to an Irish problem. The EU had, now you never read that, right? Ever, that amendment was made. But just before the 2007 election. They introduced it at 12 o'clock at night, right? And I think the Green Party and a few other people voted against it. Of course, then they get the government with the exchange. Life is like that. Now, the EU has agreed that its battle groups are mutually reinforcing with NATO response force. And it actually says in the Lisbon Treaty, quote, a more assertive union role in security and defence will contribute to the vitality of a renewed NATO. So when people were voting for the Lisbon Treaty, they were voting to revitalise a nuclear armed military alliance. And of course the EU commitment to NATO is reciprocated by NATO. At their Lisbon conference last year, as Michael has said, the EU agreed a strategic partnership. They described the European Union as a strategic partner in its NATO 2020 agreement. It seeks to create a NATO-EU agency to, quote, and it's a truly creative partnership based on the principle of reciprocity that encompasses the entire range of the institution's mutual activity. In other words, the EU and NATO are really going to have a good dance together, right? Now, the NATO is committed to keeping its nuclear weapons a first strike weapon, to build an anti-missile base to protect Europe, and to building a unified command via a European Atlantic General Staff. So, I mean, the idea that Europe over here and NATO over there, there's two separate institutions, has no validity. And to quote Admiral de Pala, the chair of the NATO Military Committee, quote, today we're in Asia, tomorrow, I don't know, Africa, or one day South America, or the Southern Pole. We decide where there is a challenge to our security. So, like, you know, the world is our oyster. So naturally enough then, the task of the EU military is to expand and to improve preemptive military action against any perceived, quote, threats. The EU now has a mutual solidarity and mutual defence clauses which oblige all member states to come to the assistance of each other. The quote is, if a member state is the victim of armed aggression on its territory, the other member state shall have towards it an obligation of aid and assistance by all means of their power in accordance with Article 21. This shall not prejudice the specific character of the security and defence of certain member states. Commitments and cooperation in this area shall be consistent with the commitments of the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation. So in other words, this, whatever defence values they have, they will be consistent with NATO. And the specific character of countries is allegedly supposed to refer to so-called neutral countries, but there are actually arguably no neutral countries left in Europe at all, in the EU. The Nuclear Armed Military Alliance Western European Union, which existed for a long time, its last remaining competence was collective security, collective self-defence. Because all the other assets, its offices and various other things, had previously been transferred to the European Union. With the Lisbon Treaty, this last remaining competence has been transferred to the European Union itself, and in June of this year, the Western European Union was abolished. We would argue as well that you can't separate out the war from terror, the war on terror, or what it's called. I don't think Obama calls that any longer, but it's still essentially the war on terror, from this whole militarisation of the European Union process. Because throughout the whole war, the Cold War, the American, in particular, economy was largely based on permanent war. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, in order to maintain its economy, it needed a new enemy. And when Samuel Huntington came up with this concept of the clash of civilizations, hey presto, you had a new enemy, and it was called fundamentalist Muslims. Now, I don't suggest for 1 minute that fundamentalist Muslims don't commit acts of terror, because it's quite patently obvious they do. I also don't think it suggests that those of us who are Republicans and who believe in the separation of church and state would think that, that we're allies with fundamentalist Muslims, because we're not. There is a very real ideological difference. But we do not support the concept of perpetual war. And we don't support these wars in Afghanistan or Iraq or Libya. And for example, the war on Iraq can't be seen outside the context. The fact that it was largely fought not just for the oil, but to defend Israel, because Iraq would have been enemy of Israel. And in fact, Solana, who was then the General Secretary on a visit to Israel, described it as a de facto, but not de jure, member of NATO. And the latest decision of the states of Europe to refuse to back the rights of the people of Palestine to their own state with full representation of the UN is a reflection of this axis and the role of Israel as perceived as part of that axis. In May of 2007, we commissioned Lansdowne Market Research to ask the Irish people, do you support the use of Shannon in these wars? 58% said no. With the help of Sinn Féin, we are now conducting another poll, exactly the same poll, and the results of that poll will be out before the presidential election. So hopefully we're going to try to make the issue of the use of Shannon an issue in the presidential election. Now, there have been massive cuts. Like, for example, these wars cost NATO $3 to $4 trillion so far. And the current cost of the war is $12 million an hour. And the reality is that despite this huge support they have from the media and from various other forces, they have lost the support of their own people. I mean, the Americans people and the people of Europe don't support these wars. In poll after poll, they don't support them. The latest one, a CBS poll in the United States, showed that 57% of Americans wanted their troops to get out of Afghanistan. And you can see, for example, what's happening now, beginning to grow in America with the occupation of Wall Street and the whole thing, the whole ability to keep control in America. And obviously you've seen the riots in Greece, you've seen the protests elsewhere, you've seen in this country the effective smashing of a political party that dominated this country for generations. These are different times. They're not the same. You can't assume they're going to be the same. They're going to be really different. And that process of change is going to continue. We essentially would argue the case that this process of the EU, US, NATO access is seeking to carry on a war by impoverishing its own people. And they just can't sustain it. It will eventually crack. It will eventually smash themselves to pieces. And I think that's absolutely inevitable. I can't see it. In other words, I can see the UE, the European Union, just breaking itself apart because it doesn't have the money to carry on these wars, and because it's obviously, as well as that, as it's spoken before, the nature of the economic structures it's created means that it just can't survive. So we would make the case that there has to be a change of philosophy, a change of policy. We have to see the end of this process of the militarization of Europe. We have to see the end of the NATO and its bases. 700, I think, the US and those contexts, they have about 700, if not more, military bases all over the world. And I think you're going to see an implosion of this axis. I think you're going to see a destruction of NATO, because it just can't do what it wants to do any longer. And I think this is a good thing, not a bad thing.
Okay.